So, without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Dr. George Locke, who's going to speak on the intensely boring topic of sex and gender in the early Christian church. Oh, I'm going to sit down.
For those of you who weren't in the room earlier, we were talking about this painting of Saint Sebastian. There is one arrow you can just about see. And I found this painting by basically Googling homoerotic saint. So that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of art you will be seeing today. And I will start with some trigger warnings because this will contain nudity, beheadings, sexual assault and torture.
Oh,
Will they?
Yes. I know. I mean, flippantly, it's all in the Bible. But non-flippantly, if you do find anything uncomfortable, I'm not going to be offended if you walk out. But when we look at Christianity today and we see how many different beliefs that there are, we have Unitarians, we have fundamentalists. And there's a big difference between the religion of the doctrine and the religion of life, your lived experience. For example, how many Catholics use birth control? Just last month in the Anglican Church, we had the Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans, GAFCON, rejecting Sarah Mullally as the new Archbishop of Canterbury and saying that they will be striking out on their own, effectively creating a separate body. So even today we have all of these things. Imagine what Christianity would be like if we didn't even have the Bible as we have it today. How much more diverse it would be. A historian of the period that I'm talking about, which is basically like the first 3 or 4 centuries of Christianity, Professor Christoph Marx, she says, in the big cities, people from the widest range of classes were won over on the broadest of fronts, and the church acted as a kind of laboratory in which different forms of theology, hierarchies of ministries, and ethics were tried out. Only very gradually does some sort of majority church become recognisable. And one of the most important takeaways from this talk will be just the amount of diversity in early Christianity. So I'm going to talk a bit about what the Bible says about sex and gender. I'm going to talk about the biblical canon, and then I'm going to talk about what early Christian writers said and how early Christian readers and listeners may have used that information. Where I quote from the Bible, I'm using the New International Version, just because it's a version that a lot of people know. If you want to move, like that's fine, but that's far more important than looking at me. So, the Bible is obviously a product of its time, and that time was over 1,000 years. Throughout all of its time, women were second-class property, and they were secondary. It should be going that way. Thank you. Here we start with our nudity. This is Solomon and his 1,000 wives and concubines, because in the Old Testament, whilst adultery was punishable by death, men could use sex workers, they could have concubines, they could have multiple wives, including young women who were captured in war, as long as they were virgins. If they weren't virgins, they would have to be put to death. And one thing I would like you to keep in mind throughout this talk is through most of history, sex and death were literally in the next room, if not in the room with you. Because you'd quite often have one family sharing a room. That family might have multiple children because, of course, the levels of death in childhood mortality. We have lots of Bible stories where people are in tents. It's very hard to be quiet in a tent. So sex and death were literally all around you. And one example that I'm going to talk about is that of Judah and Tamar. So in Genesis 38, we have the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah was the son of Jacob and Leah and a brother to Joseph. He was the brother who suggested selling Joseph into slavery. It's from him we get the tribe of Judah, whence we get the name Jewish. Tamar was married to Judah's eldest son, but was wicked in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. So Judah then had Tamar marry his second son, Onan. And he told Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, and so he spilled his seed on the ground, and God put him to death. Judah then said that he would give Tamar his youngest son Shelah when Shelah came of age. Shelah comes of age, there is no sign of this happening. But in the meantime, Judah's wife has died. So Judah goes off to visit his sheep. And Tamar hears about this and decides that she's going to disguise herself as a prostitute by putting a veil across her face. I'm not sure that that is the best veil to be using if you want to cover your face. And Judah sees her and asks to sleep with her for the price of a goat. Tamar says, well, obviously you don't have a goat with you now, so you need to give me something so that I will know that I'm going to get this goat. So he gives her his cord, his staff, and something else that I can't see on my screen. Ooh. His cord, his seal, and his staff. So they do the deed, they go home. 3 months later, Judah is told that Tamar has been prostituting herself and she is now pregnant. Judah's reaction is to say she needs to be burned alive. Tamar comes out and says, yes, I am pregnant, I have slept with someone, and it's the person who gave me this, bringing out his cord, seal, and staff. Judah has to realize that, oh, he is the father. And he says, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Not, she is more righteous than I because I slept with a prostitute, but I wanted her burned. But no, because he didn't give her Shelah. And the Bible tells us he did not sleep with her again. So that's okay. It was perfectly acceptable for Judah to do that. Sex happens less in the New Testament. Both Jesus and Paul exhort their followers to celibacy, considering it a gift. If this is impossible, you can marry, you can have sex in the sanctioned state of marriage, but generally, sex is to be avoided if you can. It is a higher calling to not have sex. And if that's heterosexual sex, what about homosexual? So in the Old Testament, we have the laws of Leviticus, where sexual acts of all kinds are condemned. For example, Leviticus 20, 10-15 gives the death penalty if a man has sex with his neighbour's wife, his stepmother, his daughter-in-law, so it's a good job Judah lived before then, another man or an animal. And in the last case, the animal is also put to death. And then we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah is a problematic and complex story. It clearly condemns sexual violence and rape. But what does it tell us, if anything, about homosexuality? Two angels visit Abraham and tell him that Sodom and Gomorrah will be destroyed due to its sinfulness. Abraham pleads with God to spare it if they can find just 10 righteous people, which they can't. Two angels then visit Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot offers them hospitality. But the men of the city demand to have relations with the visitors. They ask Lot in Genesis 19:5, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out so that we can have sex with them. The angels blind these men and warn Lot to flee, and as Lot's family flee, it rains down sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying everything and everyone. So were they destroyed because of homosexuality? Well, Ezekiel 16, 49 and 50 says that the sin of Sodom was being arrogant, overfed and unconcerned and not helping the poor and needy. So Ezekiel doesn't mention sex. This reflects modern interpretations of the stories because we have more fundamentalist churches that will say it is about homosexuality, it condemns homosexuality. We then have other interpretations where the story is seen as being about violence and greed and inhospitality. But what it doesn't do in any way is comment on mutually consenting adults of the same sex expressing love and desire. In the New Testament, we have Romans 1, 26 and 27. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also. And 1 Timothy 9 to 10, We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly, the sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, slave traders, liars and perjurers. But difficulties arise with these passages because, firstly, the ancient world did not have the same view of sex and sexuality that we do. You were not gay, bi, pan, whatever. And who you slept with did not necessarily demarcate anything about your sexuality. A lot of it had to do with power. There were also different views about male and female sexuality, as we saw with Tamar and Judah. And I cannot stress this enough. Translation is an art, not a science. Hence, today, there are almost as many views on homosexuality in the Bible as there are scholars. And because of time, I'm only going to look at one passage, and that's the 1 Timothy one. But I'm going to begin with an important caveat. Most modern scholars don't think that Paul wrote 1 Timothy. The language is very different from Galatians, for example. And then we have the term that is translated in that passage as practicing homosexuality. Arsenokoitai. It's a compound word. Two words put together. We have arsen, male, koiton, meaning bed, but with a sexual connotation, so to bed someone. It's linked to this word malakoi, which means soft. It can mean effeminate, but that could mean cowardly as much as anything else. We tend to think of effeminate far more in sexual terms. It doesn't have to mean that. So a direct translation would be soft male sex bedder. So translation is an art and not a science. And then, if it does mean homosexual sex, is that anal penetration? Is that talking about one or the other person? Is it the penetrator or the penetratee? Does it apply to women? Is it about prostitution? So many things. Because one of the difficulties with this word is it doesn't seem to have been used before this text, whether Paul wrote it or not. And it seems only to be used in Christian writings. So translating it is really quite difficult. And not only do people argue about this today, they argued about it then. So John Chrysostom, he appears to use arskenoitoi for pederasty, whereas John IV of Constantinople used it to describe heterosexual anal sex. So my takeaway from all of this is, if you believe that the Bible is the literal and inerrant word of God, don't do gay. If you believe that the Bible is in spite of God but a product of its time, proceed with caution. And if you don't think the Bible has anything to do with the way you live your life, be fabulous. So that's the sex. What about the gender? How could you be a man or a woman in the early Christian church? So again, as a product of its time, the Bible is patriarchal. It has men as leaders and warriors and women as mothers and caregivers. We have some exceptions. For example, we have Deborah, Miriam and Huldah in the Old Testament as Israelite prophets. But just as the Bible was patriarchal, so were the societies that were around it. The Jewish society, the Greek society, the Roman society. In all of these societies, women were expected to be submissive and were not allowed leadership roles. In the early church, women were attracted to what seemed a more egalitarian religion. Jesus challenged some social and gender norms. He had women around him. There were women at the most important points of his ministry. Paul mentions Phoebe and Junia. Phoebe is a deacon, a diakonos, and Paul describes Junia as outstanding among the apostles. In Galatians 3:28, Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ." This compares with 1 Timothy 2:12. "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." Remember what I said about most scholars don't think that Paul actually wrote 1 Timothy. But it doesn't matter whether it was Paul or whether it was someone pretending to be Paul. It is now in our biblical canon, and the message is that women should not be teaching in churches. They might be spiritually equal to men, but they're not leadership material. Women are gullible. They can be tricked, just as Eve was. And again, in secular society, as Pandora opened the box.
Yeah. Pandora opened the jar.
I do apologise. See, translation is an art, not a science. But speaking of the Bible canon, what text would an early Christian congregation have had access to? So imagine that we've had some Christian speakers come from the big city of Ephesus and they've told us about their new religion and we are thinking, this looks like it could be for us. They've read to us from their scrolls. We have a few scrolls of our own. We have acquired the Gospel of Mary, some letters from Paul, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which tells us about Mary's life and about how she came to marry Joseph, and it also tells us a bit about the childhood of Jesus. And we have some saints' lives, and we have the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, roughly. It was translated in the first 3 centuries before Christ, and it was the most used text. Most of the times when people in the New Testament are quoting the Old Testament, about 80 to 90% of the time, they're quoting from the Septuagint. The Septuagint also includes the Apocrypha. So we also know stories like Judith. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, our copies of these scrolls aren't the same as Stockport's. And some of their scrolls are the same as ours, but they have some differences in them. And some of the congregations around that are developing, because bearing in mind we're talking about 20 to 40 people meeting in a house, they have some strange views about Jesus, about the end of the world. We're not too sure. But we can share these scrolls around us. And of course, we're in the Roman Empire. We're Jewish, we're Greek. We're living in a patriarchal culture where women should be seen and not heard. Women are the property of their fathers. And we're also in a world of many gods. It wasn't until 341 when Constantine's son Constantius II outlawed pagan sacrifice. So think about how that is going to influence your faith, your Christianity, and how you're going to think about all of these things. So while there was debate in the early church over the Bible canon, the major writings were accepted by most Christians by the end of the 3rd century, but it took various church councils and synods to finally decide, such as the Synod of Hippo in 393 AD, the Councils of Carthage in 397 and 419 AD. Even today, different churches have different Bibles. And then we come on to levels of literacy. Only David can read, because levels of literacy were generally low. It was largely confined to the elite, the clergy, government officials, and some wealthy individuals. So we rely on David to read us from the scrolls. We're also going to rely on oral storytelling. And if you're going to use stories to build your faith, are you going to be listening to who begat whom, or a letter, or are you going to be listening to, for example, saints' lives? Lurid saints' lives. In a world of gods and demigods, saints made a lot of sense. And all of this means that Christians had very different role models to choose from when considering sex and gender. East and West differed, city and country differed, families differed, congregations differed. Now, I mentioned Judith, a story from the Apocrypha. Jerome tells us that Judith was accepted by the Nicene Council to be among the sacred scriptures. So it was a widely read and accepted book. This is Caravaggio's marvellous painting of Judith. When the Assyrians invade Israel, Judith beheads their general Holofernes, leading to the defeat of the Assyrians. Judith is introduced to the reader in the book of Judith, not as an independent warrior woman, but through 18 men. We have her patrilineal heritage going back generations to Israel and her husband Manasseh. So it's clear, no matter what Judith achieves, her social position, and the position we need to understand her through, is through men. She's described as fearing God, she has a reputation for wisdom, but the most important thing about her is she is a smoking hot babe. I could not find a classical painting of eyes coming out on stalks, so we are stuck with Tex Avery's wolf. But this is the reaction of every man who sees her. She prays to God that he allows her to crush the Assyrian arrogance by the hand of a female, the most humiliating way for male arrogance to be crushed. She dresses in her finery, she goes to Holofernes and says she can show him how to take Israel. She will go out every night and pray, and at some point God will tell her, now Holofernes needs to take Israel. Holofernes invites her to a banquet with the intention of seducing her. Unfortunately, he drinks so much that he passes out, and Judith is able to behead him. With the strength given to her by God, she couldn't do it alone as a woman. She returns home with the head, saying, "The Lord struck him down by the hand of a female," fulfilling her prayer. Assyria is indeed humiliated, they panic, and Israel wins the day. The story ends, many wished to marry her, but she gave herself to no man all the days of her life from the time her husband Manasseh died. So she remains celibate from that point on. And she doesn't die till she's 105. Because she's celibate. Yeah. So Judith was known as a mulia sancta, a holy woman. The mulia sancta was a spiritual role model who was not a virgin, who was a woman who was likely a mother, had been married. She is known for her faith and her wisdom, but every step of the way, she is able to do what she did because of her desirability, her sexual desirability. Being a smoking hot babe allows her to manipulate the men around her with God's support. But as soon as she's killed Holofernes, celibacy, the sexual danger is removed. I've said that the New Testament promoted celibacy. Early Christian texts also emphasize sexual purity and celibacy. Jesus said in Matthew 19:12, "For there are eunuchs who are born that way, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Sexual activity, as I said, was only allowed within the confines of marriage, and even then it's viewed with suspicion. So we have the 144,000 virgins in Revelation who did not defile themselves with women. Celibacy, in particular virginity, was the ideal. And in the writings of the early Christians, the concept of virginity was more important than actual virginity. How do you define the virginity? That is not a rhetorical question.
Broken hymen.
A broken hymen? What's the hymen?
It's just it's a patch of skin in the appropriate place with a little hole in it.
I like that he said a little hole, because obviously if there wasn't a little hole, every time you had a period, you'd be in big trouble. But the hymen is a piece of skin that generally loses its elasticity and stretches with age. Very rarely does one thing break a hymen, unless it is traumatic. It generally just goes over time. So no.
So it could be masturbation, or it could be
Bottom
having your
lining.
partner fondle you, or so on and so forth. So would those acts constitute losing your virginity if it isn't actually so? There's all those questions. I suppose.
Yeah. So anybody else want to give a?
Something else said horse riding. That's what I was taught about.
Yeah.
Bike riding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Have one. Yeah, some women have no hymen.
yeah.
Some women have one.
No, they do.
And some have one that elastic that it will never remove.
It never actually breaks. Yeah. So if we can't use the hymen, what do we use?
Some
Well, I suppose
women
it's
never had sex. Some women have never had sex.
Okay. Define sex.
Exactly.
Well, penetration then.
Penetration.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of what? By what?
Yes, exactly. That was going to be my next question.
Martin's learning a lot tonight.
Yes. And what about
We're getting into the depths of Nazi movies.
what about men?
What?
How do we define virginity in men?
Yeah,
You
indeed.
can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
So you can see that actually this is really difficult. this is not just okay, they're a virgin, they're not. It's so difficult. Virginity in early Christianity was a multifaceted concept. It reflected broader theological and social values, and it often went hand in hand with a wider asceticism, promoting self-denial and spiritual purity. So to be continent sexually was to be continent in all. Food, wealth, clothing. And you also have spiritual virginity. So bodily virginity might have been physical chastity, but lots of people came to the church after marrying, after having children, and then became celibate, like Judith. So they could be spiritual virgins. This was a purity of the soul. It was a higher way towards salvation. Christian virginity was dedicating oneself entirely to God, away from the obligations of everyday life and marriage. And for women, one of those obligations was the very, very, very real danger of death in childbirth. And remember that I said that sex and death were in the next room. You can imagine hearing some woman in childbirth. It could be your sister, it could be your mother. The child may or may not live. The mother may or may not live. How, again, that might affect you. The Christian emphasis on lifelong celibacy was unusual and controversial in pagan Roman times, but when Christianity became legal and accepted, celibacy as part of asceticism was a way to show your faith. If there was no danger of you actually being martyred, you martyred yourself. Jerome described the ideal virgin, and this he was largely talking about women, as thin and pallid and only ever leaving the house to go to church. Virginity was also a political issue, especially in urban areas. Early Christians often linked celibacy and asceticism to eschatological beliefs, that is, beliefs in the end of the world. Christ is about to return, therefore you want to remove yourself from the world. And not everyone agreed. In the 4th century, Jovinian argued against the promotion of celibacy and asceticism, arguing all baptized Christians, married or not, shared the same holiness. This view was condemned by Jerome and Ambrose and other church fathers who wrote texts promoting virginity. So women were under the authority of their fathers and brothers and husbands. But if a woman stepped out of that to dedicate herself to the church, she stepped out of that heteronormative system. Who was in control? So again, there was an argument between family and the church because the church said they were in control. And through all of this, the woman had a way forward where she might be able to get a bit of control over her own life. She could say that she answered to God. What is that one? So one of the stories that we will talk about in our little Christian congregation are the lives of saints. Most saints are virgins. Hagiography is the word that we use for saints' lives. Hagios means holy, and graphos means writing, holy writings. So the ultimate holy woman was Mary, the Virgin Mother of God. Or was she? So Matthew 1, 22 and 23 says, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord said through the prophet, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel. So the prophet mentioned there is Isaiah. Matthew, as I said, was using the Septuagint for this prophecy, the very popular translation of the Jewish texts. The word Isaiah uses is Alma, which usually means young woman or girl. Far more rarely is it used to specifically indicate virgin. If you wanted to do that in Hebrew, you would use the word Bethulah. But in the Septuagint, Alma is translated by the Greek Parthenos, and Parthenos definitely means virgin. Also, reading Isaiah 7 in context, the Jewish community considered it to be a prophecy that was fulfilled around 735 BCE during the siege of Jerusalem by the northern kingdom and Syria, because the next few verses state, he will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before you, the boy, Emmanuel, knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. The land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. So by the time Emmanuel is about 12, because that was the time he would be considered a man, there would be a time of milk and honey, so symbols of prosperity. And these arguments were known in the early Christian period. So Justin Martyr, who was writing in the 2nd century, he wrote the dialogue with Trypho. Trypho was supposedly a Jewish man, but obviously there was no real Trypho. But in his book, Trypho says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, but behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son," and so on. As you quoted, the prophecy refers to Hezekiah, and it is proved it was fulfilled in him. Moreover, in the fables of those who are called Greeks, it is written that Perseus was begotten of Danae, who was a virgin. He who is called Zeus descended on her in the form of a golden shower. And you ought to feel ashamed when you make assertions similar to theirs. Do not venture to tell monstrous phenomena, lest you be convicted of talking foolishly like the Greeks. So Justin is using exactly the same argument that is used today. It goes to show that these kind of things were known about back then. The earliest reference to Mary's perpetual virginity, that is the belief that she remained a virgin through Jesus' birth and beyond, is the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I mentioned earlier. Again, mid-century text and incredibly popular. And again, the Church Fathers disagreed. Clement of Alexandria and Origen argued Mary was a perpetual virgin. Tertullian disagreed. The Second Council of Constantinople in 533 made it official, and Mary was declared Aethe Parthenos, ever virgin. So what kind of role model was she for early Christians? Well, as a virgin mother, certainly one that no one could live up to. And in the Bible, she speaks less than 200 words. One of the speeches that she has is what we call the Magnificat, where she says, "I am the Lord's servant. May it happen to me according to your words," when Gabriel tells her that she is pregnant with Jesus. So, in the Latin, the Lord's servant, that phrase that she uses, is ancilla Domini. So remember, Judith was the Mulia Sancta, Mary is the ancilli Dei, a virgin, and this became an important trope for early Christian women. However, not all women were silent and passive like Mary. In contrast, we have Thecla. In the Latin, why is that? Oh, because of that, yes. Thecla's story is recounted in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. 2nd century text, again, wildly popular. Thecla overhears Paul preaching, goes to see him, decides she wants to become a Christian. But her mother and her fiancé are not happy about this because they fear that she wants to now become a virgin and stay a virgin and not get married. She's caught visiting Paul. Paul is kicked out. Thecla is stripped naked. Remember I said saints' tales were lurid. There is a lot of bared breasts in saints' tales. She's sentenced to death at the stake. Thecla is saved from being burned at the stake by a storm. She decides to follow Paul. A nobleman at this point attempts to rape her, but she fights back and is then arrested. And she's sentenced to death, this time by wild beasts. So she's thrown into the arena, but she's protected by the female beasts. She takes this opportunity to baptize herself by throwing herself into some water that has man-eating seals, but the seals are killed by lightning. So she's done all of this, and then she goes to see Paul. She cuts her hair, she dresses as a man, and she says, "I have received baptism, for he who commanded you to preach has commanded me to baptize." Paul sends her to Iconium, but she goes to preach in Seleucia. So Thecla is very different to Mary. She was active, she was independent, she was dynamic, and she inspired many women to seek greater control over their lives and choice and lead lives of religious devotion outside of the traditional role models. And she's one of many cross-dressing female saints. We have Anastasia the Patrician, Matrola of Perge, Apollinaria, Eugenia of Rome, Euphrosyne of Alexandria.
I'll ask you a quick question. How do we know she was cross-dressing?
Because the texts tell us that she dressed as a man. Yeah, by that I don't mean anything other than the fact that she dressed as a man. Finally, I'm going to look at Paula. Now, unlike Thecla, Paula did exist. She was a Roman noblewoman. She was born around 347, so after Christianity has been favoured by Constantine, the Edict of Milan was in 313, which guaranteed religious tolerance. So her world would have been very different from the world that Thecla is supposed to have existed in. After the death of her husband, Paula devoted herself to a life of prayer and penance. She met with Jerome and she worked closely with him, learning Hebrew and helping him on translating what became the Vulgate. She gave him financial support, she offered spiritual encouragement. They shared a deep spiritual and intellectual partnership. And when Jerome left Rome, largely because of gossip about him and Paula, she followed him and eventually settled in Bethlehem, where she founded a monastery, a convent, and a hostel for pilgrims. And much of what we know about Paula, we know because of Jerome. Jerome had very complex views on women. He admired Paula, he admired her spirituality, her intellectualism. He commended her and her daughter for their dedication to the monastic life. He was also a raging misogynist. Women in general, he denigrated. They were overly concerned with their appearance, they were obsessed with makeup, they were flirtatious, they were spiteful, quarrelsome, and jealous. Women had to be masculine in character to overcome their base female natures. And they did this through virginity and celibacy. For Jerome and other Christian writers, spiritual strength and self-discipline, controlling desire and passion were masculine virtues. Paula was not a virgin. She was a widow and a mother. But she was celibate, therefore she was a spiritual virgin. She was described as virile, manly in her faith. Another influential writer on this was St. Augustine of Hippo. And in his Confessions, he writes of his pre-Christian sexual life, where he fathered a son, and then his conversion to Christianity via a flirtation with Manichaeism, which saw the world as satanic. And this idea that the physical is satanic seems to have stayed with Augustine through his writings. Both of these men, Jerome and Augustine, placed celibacy above marriage, and in line with Roman philosophical belief at the time, believed self-control and the pursuit of virtue were masculine qualities. They allowed women like Paula, like Augustine's mother Monica, to be virile, masculine qualities achievable and necessary for Christian women because they needed to overcome all the flaws of their sex. Jerome wrote, "The virgin is no longer called a woman." And with asceticism, which I said was closely linked, you also have the potential for amenorrhea, where the periods disappear, cessation of the loss of your curves if you're strictly dieting. So all the signs of womanhood that we would have seen in the Mulia Sancta, like Judith, might not be in the Virgin, ambiguous both in physical appearance. So finally, I'm going to look at some male saints. This is Sergius and Bacchus. Their story is told in the Passion of Sergius and Bacchus, and in this context, passion just means suffering. The story is set in the reign of Emperor Galerius, which is 305 to 311, but it was probably written a couple of centuries later. The saints were Roman soldiers and Christian martyrs. They shared a deep spiritual bond, and their relationship was rooted in their mutual faith and their commitment to Christianity. They were favoured by the emperor until they refused to take part in a pagan sacrifice where they were outed as Christians and arrested. They were humiliated by being dressed as women and paraded in public. Then Bacchus was beaten to death and Sergius was tortured and beheaded. So we've seen being manly is something a woman needs, but being feminized is humiliating for a man. The relationship between the two saints is referred to as adelphopiosis. I was really hoping my friend Steph would be here tonight because she's Greek. Adelphos means brother, and poio is to make. So this was an Orthodox Christian tradition which could unite two people of the same sex in not exactly a marriage, it was more akin to siblinghood. So the ceremony involved prayers, spiritual readings, the exchange of crosses, but it created a spiritual brotherhood, very different from biological kinship. And it was formalized in a way that individuals, and when I say individuals, overwhelmingly men, we don't really have evidence of women doing this, could support their social standing. It reinforced male-dominated social and economic networks. It was important for business, for political alliances. But could it be a same-sex romantic relationship? The historian John Boswell thought so, but he is in a minority of scholars. The oldest text that we have of the story of Sergius and Bacchus uses the Greek term erastai, which can mean lovers. It's the plural form of erastes, which usually refers to the older lover in a pederastic relationship. But the fact that they're both called that, that raises questions. The bond between them was celebrated in the church for depth, loyalty, and spiritual connection. They were seen as a symbol of unity. Did the early Christian church see them as lovers? No. Did an individual Christian man who realized he was sexually attracted to other men read the story as lovers? If I had a penny for every lesbian that said to me, "Oh, isn't Calamity Jane gay?" Because we can read these things into texts, into films, into the things that we see. So we saw with Jerome and Paula that even the most misogynistic of Christians could treat a woman that he knew and respected very differently from the way that he speaks about women in general. The same could be the case for women or same-sex couples in a small community of just 20 people meeting in a house to discuss this new faith. We just don't know. This is the sarcophagus of the brothers. It's owned by the Vatican, and they've called it the sarcophagus of the brothers. It dates to around 325, 350, so exactly the time I've been talking about. The Vatican describes this. The portraits were originally intended for a couple, and only once the work was in process did it become necessary to adapt them to represent the two men, possibly brothers. Now, the positioning of the men in the centre is exactly the same that you would get for a heterosexual couple, where you'd have the husband there and the wife holding his arm. There are scholars who will argue for this being a married couple. I'm not convinced. And if it is, I return to my point about the fact that just because something went on in a congregation doesn't mean that the church ever accepted it. So, what did the early church really think about sex and gender? Well, the first question there is, who were the early church? Was it the men who wrote the texts and had the synods and the meetings and made the decisions? Or was it the people who met in the houses, who met in groups of 20 or 40 and discussed this new faith and worked out what they believed with their communities? Historians will continue to debate the meanings of words. Language is flexible, words change, they are used in so many different ways. But just as we today can use these texts and navigate what we believe, what we don't believe, what others may believe, so that they could. So for those individuals who did meet in the early Christian centuries, what do you think? Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments? I'm going to hold a microphone. If you're going to speak, I'll pass you the microphone. Okay, so put your hands up. Just indicate if you'd like to speak. Yes, there you go.
I'm curious about the reality. Were those who were rich, famous leaders, was this what they told the brethren, or did the brethren actually...
So can you say that again? Sorry, I didn't quite catch all of it.
So were the rich and the famous, wealthy and whatever, were they just carrying on with their own lives? And was this just for the pious?
'Twas ever thus.
Yes.
So if you've got money and power, you can basically live the life that you want. I mean, the whole reason Constantine did not get baptized until he was on his deathbed is the idea is once you're baptized, once you have accepted Christ, that is it. Any sin you make after that is going to count. So basically, for people like that, you just didn't get baptized until the very last minute when you knew there was absolutely no way that you could sin.
The other thing is, of course, with Constantine, he was torn between Christianity and believing in Sol Invictus.
Yeah. Yeah, so
that's why a lot of images of him are of him as Sol Invictus.
Yeah.
He was hedging his bets.
As were lots of people. And that's the case in for centuries. The thing with Constantine was when he saw his vision at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, what he probably saw was what we call sundogs, which is where the sun is at a certain point and it sort of refracts into what looks like crosses. So essentially, he saw something like a rainbow. It wasn't a rainbow, it was a sundog. And hey, we're Christian. So, but it could easily have gone another way.
So you referred to a number of biblical texts, but am I right in thinking that in the non-Judaic or the non-Abrahamic area, in the pagan sort of Roman and Greek, there was quite a different view of gay relationships?
It depends on who you are, where you are, when you are. So essentially, it was assumed that if you were a classical Greek, you would sleep with younger boys. That said nothing about you. But the assumption was, when you got to a certain age, you would marry and have children because that's what a good citizen did. And when it came to a lot of the Roman things, sex, you weren't allowed to let it overpower you. But again, it was all about being the active partner, whether you were, whoever you were penetrating. So you've got all of that, but one of the things that's really interesting is you always have exceptions, always in history. So this is a later example, but I think it kind of works well because it's something that most people know. Do you remember A Knight's Tale, the film with Heath Ledger? Does anyone?
Yes, yes, it was a knight thing.
Yes, A Knight's Tale. Does anyone remember what his character was called?
No.
Okay, so his character was called Ulrich von Liechtenstein.
Yes, that's right.
Ulrich von Liechtenstein was a real person. Ulrich von Liechtenstein was incredibly well known for his jousting skills, but at some point he decided to joust as a woman. He dressed as a woman and did it. We have art in medieval art of this man dressed as a woman jousting. Like generally in medieval history, that was just horrific. You'd no, because all the things associated with women, you don't want them associated with you. We always have exceptions to the rule. He just did it.
Because he could get away with it.
Yeah, rich and famous, he could get away with it.
Well, probably famous for the jousting skills.
Yeah.
And then when he comes on dressed as a woman, oh, he's doing this.
You need to remember the microphone, LB.
I've got I don't know whether it's going to just be your opinion or not here, but what thing that always amazes me is how you can look at sort of those translations and see the different ways that it could have been translated, and yet people still hold very hard and fast to particular translations that may or may not be right. And also when I was watching your presentation, wondering about my fundamentalist father and how he might respond to that, and why do you think it is that they can't let go of that, or that they can't see that? My dad's very educated and he could tell you the Greek translations and this translation or whatever. I don't understand why he can't see the balance.
I know, it's bizarre, isn't it? So a bit of history about me. I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. I completed this PhD. So I basically spent 4 years of my life studying the Bible, sex and gender. At the end of those 4 years, I was still a Jehovah's Witness. I was still your father. Just like how? Now I look back and I go, how? But it's so ingrained into your identity. You are losing your identity when you step away from that. It's not just, this is the text that I know, this is the text I'm comfortable, this is the text I think is right. My identity is with this text. If this text is wrong, how much of my life have I got to, how much was I wrong? What have I done? There's so much to it, the emotional connection, that it is really hard. But I think for those of us who are on the outside, it is bizarre. I'm not sure that helps at all.
How did you kind of rationalise it at the time?
At the time, I think my rationality, so I was a Jehovah's Witness since I was born, so I didn't know anything else, right? So it was my entire worldview. And I I think for me, I took the view that of all the religions, even if Jehovah's Witnesses weren't entirely right about everything, they were the closest to what must be correct. And therefore, any bits that had started to like, on me, I would just sort of put them to the back and say, but it's still right. The helicopter view is still right. There's still going to be Armageddon and paradise. That's what I wanted. So all of those little uncomfortable bits, I just did not think about. As soon as you learn that as soon as you start to go down that route, it's not going to end well. So you just go, okay, switch off, thought-stopping techniques and all of that kind of thing. So that's essentially what I did until I think I got to a point where there was just too much and I couldn't.
The JW don't use the same Bible as the evangelical Christians, or they?
No, they've got their own translation. Yeah.
Is it similar? I don't know.
It's similar. It's got Jehovah in it a lot.
Is it the same structure? Or
it's exactly the same. It's just the translation. But it's not. Unlike Catholic Bibles, it doesn't have the Apocrypha in it. So it's still like Anglican.
I didn't know the Catholic Bible had the Apocrypha in it.
Douay version.
Which books are they?
Tobit, Judith, stuff. Do you remember? Yeah.
About 5 or 6.
Yeah. Wisdom, yeah.
Ecclesiasticus.
Thank you.
Who's next?
This is a more general question about humanity. And humanity and what we might call sex, both gender, but also the sexual act or the sexual acts. Why do you think we make such a big thing of it? Why do you think faces go red when it's talked about?
Well, exactly. And I go back to what I said at the start. Through most of history, it was part of life. Like, if you're in the same room as your parents and you're one of 10 kids, you've heard a hell of a lot of sex. You've seen death. So I think for us, it's partly the Victorians, because they were just hypocritical as anything when it came to these kind of things, and partly that we have removed everything from our circle. Like, it now happens over there, whether it's sex or death. It doesn't happen right in front of us. So I think that's got a lot to do with this. And we are very much, even though this might not be a Christian country now, that is our heritage. So all of the ideas that are in the Bible around sex being defiling are the things that our society have grown up with. So I think that's why.
But you don't feel that's been true of other religions or no religion?
Oh, completely. Yeah. It's the same in Islam, I would say. Yeah. It's the same kind of views.
And the same about talking about women in general, anything regarding their bodies.
Maybe not so much in Hinduism. It depends. I don't know enough about non-Christian, non-Abrahamic religions. So
I'm thinking, say, of China, which certainly wasn't a Christian country, and women had their feet bound, so they couldn't walk.
So a lot of that is because you need to make sure your woman is yours, like, because you want to make sure that it's your kids. So you want to make sure that no other man is going to have any sort of attachment, effect. He's not going to be attracted. So women, because they were property, were very much, that's more a power thing.
Almost sorry if you didn't say that. I was going to say, and you see that going on in war.
Oh, completely.
Where women are raped. You see it happening in the Sudan now.
So one of the things, this is a horrible thing to say, but I think everybody should know this. I only discovered this at the weekend. In the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, there were brothels for the prisoners. Not for the guards, for the prisoners. So these were non-Jewish women, because generally the German law was that you couldn't sleep with a Jew if you were not Jewish. So these had to be non-Jewish women. They were generally Polish or German prisoners. And they were made to have sex with the prisoners because that would keep the prisoners working. I can't imagine anything more horrific. All of that horror around you, and then you're being made to be a sex worker. So yeah.
Something about men.
And if anybody's interested in that, Betwixt the Sheets, which is a podcast, did an episode on it last week, which is why I heard about it.
We're the only species, I think I'm right in this, that wears clothes. So you're talking about embarrassment, and so you just imagine for a moment, if you will, I'm going to click my fingers and everybody in the room's naked. Can you see how that might change your views about sex and what's appealing and what isn't appealing and what's embarrassing and what we might... So clothing might be partly responsible for our uncertainties about sex and our likes and dislikes. Perhaps, I don't know that for certain. So. Well,
I was going to say, that being said, we won't live at such northerly latitudes as Manchester is. That being said, we won't live at such northerly latitudes as Manchester exists without clothing.
I think it's colder somewhere else, though. There we go.
I don't think you're right, David. I think
I don't care if you don't think I'm right.
the people were talking about before. If you lived in Equatorial Africa, you wouldn't wear many clothes, would you? But as we move north into colder climates, you wear clothes to keep warm.
And?
Well, that becomes a norm, doesn't it? So if you don't have clothing, you're not normal.
Normalization. That's what I was thinking about as well.
Yeah.
So if you say right now,
So yeah, if you look at the
I'm
clothes,
loud
it is
enough, I
normal,
think.
so, yeah.
Yeah, if you say that you snap your hand and everybody will be naked, that will become the reality, and it will be normalized. There is people who are what do you call them, nudist, as part of their life, and that doesn't make them having sex 24 hours because they are just naked, but that's how they live. But when it's come to sexuality in a lot of, not just religions, cultures comes into that, it's a lot around the hetero element of male and female power dynamic. And one of the things which, it's about the control, as you said, and the power. And there's still existing tribes that the man have the control over the woman, that he own her as a property, that if the man travel, he will sew, the woman will be sewn and not unsewn until he comes back to ensure. Sewn, yeah, they will sew her genitals.
Oh, I see, all right.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And then, can you imagine the pain going back and forth if that happened constantly? But that doesn't apply to the man.
Yes.
So it's always about that element. It's the power dynamic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Somebody else? Anybody else? Oh, just behind you.
Oh, I didn't see. Oh, sorry.
Hello, I don't know how pertinent it is, but you were talking about virgins before. Martin and I have had this conversation about how virgins were always sort of, the virginness and, worshipped or whatever. I can't think of the correct words. But we talked about this, and I've always had the question, well, what about a male virgin? I mean, I can understand it's a bit like it's power, but was there more to it than that?
For men?
Yeah, I suppose so.
So virginity wasn't as important for men, but in saints' lives, quite often they are, because the whole point there is you are showing that you have rejected the world. You have a higher calling, so you've rejected the world. And that could be through monasticism, through asceticism, the desert fathers going out. So it was about what you were broadcasting to the world. And it was important because you were showing that you were a better Christian and therefore more holy. So that's where it would kind of like, and one of the interesting things with male saints' lives is like women are generally threatened with torture because they won't submit. Men are generally threatened with lascivious women, often demons, but generally they are tempted by sex, not pain. That, you know, that's the dynamic between the two. So I think that kind of demonstrates how even just the thought of sex was seen as so tempting that the fact that these men can turn it down, can be like, no, I am here for God, would show their strength.
Yeah, could I just come back on that? Because I think it even happens today when you see perhaps young girls being groomed. Is there any sort of connection there?
No, I mean the connection is again just male power.
Yeah, I thought so. Thank you.
So it follows that the Muslim heaven of 72 virgins is really hell.
But they're not asking them to not.
Yeah, that's the difference.
That's the difference.
You can. It's like wine. Once you're in heaven, you can partake.
Yeah. See, that's for me. I come from. I'm an ex-Muslim, and I always ask the questions about. So why, if wine is not allowed and we can't, like, it's marriage need to be the thing and so on, why suddenly everything is allowed? Like, you could have as many women, you'll have rivers of wine. So we are tested to gain the ultimate.
Yeah. Once you get to heaven,
yeah,
it's fine.
Everything is fine. It's okay.
You know, it's something unusual about the Islamic view of heaven. It's a lush paradise, fountains and everything.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of a desert.
I think that's the thing.
Is anybody else? Oh, no, I'm going to. No, anybody else? I had a comment. Oh, go on. Yeah. Go on, trying to remember mine because it's gone from my
I'm
head.
not really aware of this, but is there anything about transgender, about gender identity, bisexual and so on?
I'm so glad you asked. So starting with the really important caveat that people in the past did not have the same ideas that we had, right? Also, we cannot read minds. We know that some people cross-dressed. That doesn't mean to say they were transgender. Doesn't mean to say they weren't. So we don't know. But what we can do is like read the text and see how they can be read by different people. So if you get a transgender person to, for example, so one of the things I didn't talk about is Euphrosyne, who was one of the cross-dressing saints. So Euphrosyne became a monk and is so aesthetic, loses all her feminine attributes. Nobody in any way thinks that she is a woman, but she's still very attractive. So the monks are still tempted by Euphrosyne, even when she's being a man. So she goes off like on her own, and she kind of keeps this up pretty much her entire life. She does tell her father on the deathbed who she is, but stays a monk, an ascetic monk, her entire life. Now, for me, I could quite see that as being someone who is transgender in their identity. But I don't know. If you got a transgender person to read that text, they might read it differently. So I think that's the interesting thing. It's what we as individual readers can do with these texts and how we look at these stories and see ideas reflected and played with. We do also have a couple of quite effeminate male saints. I think it was you who said about Greek, using archetypes and things like that. So there was quite a fashion for romances in Hellenistic Greece. And we see a lot of the tropes used in these romances in saints' lives. And it's very unusual, but we do occasionally see, for example, a male saint being portrayed in the way that a woman would be portrayed in the Greek romance. So we do have these things that are played around with. They may have been played around with by transgender people back then, but we will never know.
Was anybody else? Stephen Pinker's had some interesting things recently. He's been talking about language and how, and I suppose this goes back to embarrassment and clothes wearing maybe, but he's been talking about things like, two people, a boy and a girl, male and female, been out for an evening, and the guy says to her something along the lines of, "Would you like to come up and watch Netflix?" So there's this current of not quite understanding what the words mean, what the interpretation of the words mean. Whereas, I'm just saying this for fun, you understand? Whereas if neither parties were wearing clothes, it would be apparent as to whether or not they were both up to have sex. So I just raised that point. Right, see what I'm saying?
So if neither of them were wearing clothes,
yes, exactly,
it would be clear that both of them. So how would you tell that the woman was?
Oh well, that's not for me to say.
But that's what I mean.
But the reality is that if you're naked, then you might get pheromones, you might get scent, you might get complexion, you might get blushing, etc., etc., etc. The whole range. So you might be able to, rather than, and I hasten to add, I'm not suggesting everybody goes naked. Please don't think that. But it would be easier. And so there's this build-up of embarrassment. She thinks, what the hell does he mean? Does he want me to go upstairs with him to have sex eventually? Or is he genuinely going to show me a really interesting film? And there's this, and then this embarrassment things builds up because neither party quite knows what the other's saying. So, yeah.
I think most people would understand the innuendo of that, wouldn't they? Of what she was being suggested would be going on.
That also assumes that there is a decision made quite early on as to what someone wants, whereas that could change over the evening.
Apparently, when two people are, a boy and a man and a woman, together in a pub just talking, if they're going to have sex, you can usually tell by watching because they mirror each other's gestures. If the man puts his hand forward, the woman will put her hand forward, and this can go for hours on end. And it's
they're doing the hokey cokey for a couple of hours, and at the end of that,
it's the old song. You put your left hand in, left hand out. Go ahead.
Can I just come back to on the clothing issue? Because
yes, that's his issue. That is not mine.
Because there's a lot of prohibition about women wearing certain clothing, and the pictures that we see of the saints, the monks are dressed in very particular ways. So I can see that some people would wear particular clothes to signal that they were of a particular faith, but I'm just curious about when that may have started, and is it fairly late for things like the burqa and so on to come in?
So, when we see depictions of saints, we are using visual language. So, I'm sure most people realise that Mary is generally depicted in blue because she is the Queen of Heaven. So there is a language used when we see the picture. Yeah. The way that they're described in stories, it's often about the fact that they're wearing rags or clothes mean nothing. That's the whole point. Like Mary of Egypt was naked, just wandering around naked, because clothes are just not important anymore for her. It's like she's so beyond. So that's in the stories, yes, that starts quite early, but like a lot of the language that we see in the paintings and the visual art, that would be much later.
So do we know when?
I don't know enough about that, I'm afraid.
It dates from Hellenistic Greece. It was written by Hellenistic Greeks and Sassanid Persians, etc.
I think I'm right in saying is that there has been some research work done that Muslim males are actually sexually attracted by the burqa, for example. So it's that.
It's what you've got around you. I mean, that's.
Well, exactly. You know, if you're fully
the,
clothed, it's a bit tricky, isn't it?
There was an interesting book, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it's basically the story of some women in Afghanistan who got out through playing cricket.
Who
got out through playing cricket.
Oh right, okay.
And this woman is describing how men could tell a lot more about you in a burqa than you might realise. So, for example, all they've got to do is like get close enough to nudge, and they can tell whether that's boob or that's whatever. They can see ankles potentially as you move, as you go upstairs and stuff like that. Is the ankle small? Is the ankle large? There are all these things that you could tell if you know the language you're looking for, which we wouldn't if we were looking at someone. But if you're in that society and you know what you're looking at, yeah.
I'd just like to say thank you very much, Dr. George Locke.
Pleasure.
Fantastic evening.